Welcome to Voice on Climate YouTube podcast, designed by youth to mainstream the awareness about climate change and urging for climate action. Today, it's me, Lulu, again, your host for this podcast. And our topic for this third episode will be young people's role in adapting and mitigating to climate change. Having become the major discussion in climate negotiations, it is undeniable that the climate change has a detrimental contribution to extreme weather events. Therefore, adjusting to the current and future effects of climate change and making the impacts of climate change less severe is pivotal. Therefore, mitigation and adaptation are the two major pillars to combat the climate crisis. This podcast will attempt to reveal the impacts of climate change to human and biodiversity, understanding mitigation to reduce climate change impact, understanding adaptation pathways to address climate change impact, and the role of young people in adapting and mitigating to climate change. Together with us, our guest speaker, Ruqia Abdullah, a Max Thabiso Edkins Climate Ambassador 2023, an initiative of Global Youth Climate Network by World Bank Group Youth to Youth Community, will share her insights upon this topic. Hi, Ruqia, how are you?
Hi, I'm good. How are you?
Doing good. Wonderful. Ruqia, before we jump onto the discussions, would you like to tell us about your current activities related to climate actions apart from being a Max Thabiso Edkins Climate Ambassador?
Yes, sure. Hello, everyone. This is Ruqia from Yemen. I'm working currently with the United Nations World Food Programme in the field of food security, livelihoods, and climate adaptation. I'm overseeing so many and several projects in climate adaptation with the vulnerable communities in rural areas to give them the needed support to be more resilient against the current climate crisis. This is for my current roles. I'm engaging with mostly the vulnerable communities, marginalized groups, which are being badly impacted by this crisis nowadays.
I see. Hoping that your wonderful work will continue to inspire young people to act for climate, especially. Now, let's move on to the discussion. Ruqia, I would like to ask, according to your observation, what are the actual impact of climate change to human and also the biodiversity?
As we know, this climate change crisis is almost one of the most significant and critical issues and challenges that we're facing. The whole world is facing this issue. And climate change is caused by human activities, such as burning fossil fuels, deforestation, and the huge improvement we are facing in the industry processes. And this lead to release large amounts of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And that is what has caused the climate change. And I believe that we all know that one of the most significant impact of climate change on human is the increase in extreme weather events, such as heat waves, droughts, floods, and storms. These events can cause significant damage to the infrastructure, homes, businesses, to livestock, agriculture lands, community livelihoods, and so many other things. And this would lead to economic losses and damages, and also will lead to a huge displacement of people. We'll have so many RDPs. And this also extreme weather events can lead to food shortage and water scarcity. And that would lead to severe consequences like food insecurity, malnutrition, and other human health issues and well-being. And here I can come up with a live example of this issue, which is happening in my country here in Yemen. Nowadays, we're facing heavy rains, and that leads to floods. And due to the bad and poor infrastructure here in my country, people are facing and getting badly impacted by this issue. They are losing their main source of incomes. They are losing their agricultural lands. They are losing their livelihoods, main source of incomes. And this would lead to food insecurity. Another impact of this issue on human is the spread of diseases. As you know, this temperature rise, when it goes up and goes down, it leads to diseases such as malaria and dengue fever, and that would spread among all the communities, especially the vulnerable communities, which don't have the ability to adapt to such events. Regarding the biodiversity, as we know, with the time passing, we are seeing that so many species are being extended due to the temperature rise. When the temperature is raised, some species have to migrate to cooler areas so they can live according to their preferences. So, and if this is still happening, maybe it's not maybe, I believe we will reach that point if we don't do the processes that we should do to adapt and mitigate to this issue, and that would lead to loss of biodiversity and ecosystems.
Now, according to your answer, I see that this particular impact of climate change is multi-sectoral. I think we will get a social, economic, health, and environmental impacts all in one. Now, does this climate change only affect the livelihood on land, or are there any parts that the climate crisis affects, for example, like the life below water or in the atmosphere itself?
As I mentioned, climate change is a crisis that is impacting everything. Maybe we can notice that some parts are being impacted in indirect way, but with time, they will be impacted directly. So climate change does not only affect livelihoods, it affects so many various other parts of our planet. And this climate crisis has a significant impact, for example, on the oceans and the atmosphere, as you mentioned. For example, regarding the oceans are being affected by climate change in several ways. For example, the temperature of the ocean is increasing due to the climate change that we're facing. And this temperature, when it's increased, it leads to the death of marine life. Other impact that ocean is facing is the acidity of the ocean. It's increasing due to the absorption of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, which affects the growth and survival of the marine organism and the marine life that we do have under the oceans and seas. Also, sea levels are being also raised due to the melting of the ice sheets, as we've been noticing, and that can cause floods and extreme floods, and that would lead to damage for the coastal areas. One more thing for the atmosphere, it's impacted by climate change as the concentration of greenhouse gases such as, carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide is increasing in the atmosphere. And that would lead to global warming, which is the most critical issue that we're facing with the climate change. And with global warming, we'll face more extreme events such as hurricanes, droughts, and floods. And that would lead us again to the issues that we mentioned in the first questions, and would impact directly the communities, the economies, to all levels, community level, national level, international level, and would damage the whole planet.
Okay, now these things make sense. We see that climate change not only impacting the livelihood on land, but also under the water, in the atmosphere. Everything is impacted by climate change. Not only that, it brings effect to the communities itself. As you mentioned earlier, that therefore climate adaptation is important to enhance resilience. Let's take a step back here. What is actually a climate adaptation, and what actions do really count as a climate adaptation?
Okay, we've been hearing this theme or this word adaptation in so many discussions, and it's also repeated in all discussions. Climate adaptation refers to the process of adjusting to the current or expected climate change and the impacts that is causing. We use this adaptation in so many other projects, not only in climate adaptation. We're using it also, as you know, I'm working now in other sectors, such as livelihoods and food security, and we're trying to engage the adaptation with all our projects so we can give the community itself, the community members, the ability to be more resilient against any shocks, not only climate change shocks. So when they do have this ability to be resilient against such shocks, the impact on them, it will not be that huge. Once the shock is happening, they will have the ability to face this one. And adaptation involves taking actions to reduce vulnerability and increase resilience to climate change impacts. such as sea level rise, extreme weather events, floods, for example, changes in temperature, and so many other events. And there are so many various actions that we can do as climate adaptation. And I'm currently so happy that I'm noticing that UN agencies, international organizations, youth-led initiatives, civil society organizations, they are focusing on such projects, on climate adaptation projects, and they're fundraising so many funds so they can support such projects. We can mention, for example, one of the main projects that we're, for example, here establishing in Yemen, which is infrastructure improvements. And this involves upgrading the infrastructure systems, such as roads, bridges, buildings, agriculture lands, and so many other community assets, which would give community the ability to adapt in case they face any shocks. Second, we can, as you know, our countries are rich with natural resources, but we need to manage these resources in a good way so we can benefit from them the maximum we can. For example, we have forests, we have wetlands, water resources, we have agriculture lands, we have so many other resources that if we manage them in a good way, we will enhance the ability of the community to adapt. For example, such as planting the drought resistant crops. If you have heard about this one, this will lead to a good managing of the water resources that we're having instead of using other kind of crops that would lead to use a huge amount of waters. This is one kind of actions that can be implemented in adaptation. And one of the actions that for myself I love so much, which is disaster risk reduction. And I'm happy that I have heard during COP27 that almost $3.1 billion was committed to establishing the early warning systems by 2027. And you know, this disaster risk reduction, when you reduce the risk of disasters that is caused by climate change, we have to establish early warning systems, emergency preparedness plans, and other measures. For example, developing evacuation plans for communities. So when they are facing floods or wildfires or any other events, the community itself, the country itself has the systems that would support them to adapt directly and act directly with not getting the community badly impacted by these events. One more thing, and I believe this is the last point in this one, the health systems. I believe we have to pay great attention to health system and improve them to address the health impacts of climate change. As we have mentioned that climate change impacting the health of communities, and if we develop new technologies on health system, I believe that would help the communities to adapt against the climate crisis.
I really agree on that part because it is very important, especially on the part of infrastructure development for resilience, disaster risk reductions, for readiness, and then most importantly, the health system improvement itself. All right. Now, oftentimes we heard the term adaptation and mitigation are inseparable in many climate discussions. Because we already entangle the definition and also the action that counts as an adaptation. Now, what is actually a mitigation and what actions do count as a mitigation action?
As you know, adaptation and mitigation, they complete each other. We can say in this way. Mitigation refers to action taken to reduce or prevent the greenhouse gas emissions, thereby reducing the extent and impact of climate change. And this can be done or achieved through various of activities, including, for example, the use of renewable energy sources, energy efficiency measures, and other technologies. And basically, mitigation efforts is to address the root cause of climate change by reducing the amount, as we mentioned, of the greenhouse gases. However, adaptation refers to the actions that we take to adjust to the impacts of climate change that are already happening or we are expecting to happen in the future. And this includes, as we mentioned in the previous one, the measures we can take, such as building, for example, the sea walls to protect against rising sea levels, developing drought-resistant crops, and improving water management practices. And basically, the main objective of adaptation is to reduce the vulnerability of the communities and ecosystems to the impacts of climate change, to support them to be more resilient against these shocks. Both of them, they are important components to address the climate change. They differ in their focus and objectives, as we mentioned, but both of them, they are very important. They are very critical to support the communities against climate change. As we mentioned, what does mitigation mean? As we mentioned that we use these offers to reduce or prevent the negative impacts of the events or situations that are happening from climate change. There are so many actions that we can lead for mitigation. As a youth, my main perspective for this, it's the advocacy, awareness. If we have proper advocacy, if we have a community which is very aware of this crisis, I believe this action has to be highlighted by youth, by all stakeholders that are working in climate change. General activities, we have reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and that could be done through several activities, as we mentioned, using, for example, cleaner energy sources and stop using the fossil fuels, improving energy efficiency, implementing policies that encourage sustainable practices. We need to implement the disaster preparedness measures, and that would involve to prepare for natural disasters such as hurricanes, earthquakes, floods, and other things, such as building stronger infrastructure, developing early warning system, and creating emergency response plan. So many other examples of mitigation actions, including improving as well health measures, promoting sustainable agriculture practices, and investing in renewable energy technologies.
I see.
Yeah.
There's an interesting point right there you raised. You said that young people has a very important role, especially in advocacy for mitigation and adaptation action. In your experience as a young people, what are the challenges that you often face, especially in conducting such action?
As a youth, we may face more issues than other organizations may face because, for example, in such countries which our countries, less developing countries, we're facing these issues, and it has been so difficult for us to create initiatives, to create new activities, to present new innovations or new technologies, because due to the emergency situation that we're facing, our governments, our policies are being just focusing on the emergency sector. They're not focusing on this sustainable sector, which will focus on it. We will have the impact for several coming years. And this is one of the main challenges, which is political. So many countries and industries are resistant to making changes that could impact their bottom line or require significant investment in new technologies. And there is often a lack of consensus of what actions should be taken and who should be responsible for them. And this can lead to delays in implementing effective policies and programs. One other issue is climate change is not a small issue. It's a global issue that it's impacting the whole world. And that requires a very high efficient coordination. We have to have action across multiple sectors and levels of governments, several levels, several stakeholders. And it also involves a wide range of stakeholders, including scientists, policy makers, businesses, individuals. And finding solutions that work for everyone can be somehow difficult, especially when there are competing interests and priorities.
Exactly. That is an important point to be considered. And you have raised it not only challenges, but also how to really solve it. Like global cooperation is very important at the current moment because there is no country that should be left behind in this particular issue to address climate change.
Another challenge is the cost of adaptation measures. We know due to the crisis that we're having in several countries in the emergency situation, that leads to decrease of the investments that we have. So many of the strategies of adaptation and mitigation that can help the communities require significant amount of resources and investment, and that can be challenging for low-income communities or countries or less developed countries to have these funds. And one more thing, it's the awareness, as I mentioned before, a huge need of awareness and education about climate change and its impact. And many people in our countries and our communities, they still do not fully understand the issue of climate crisis and its implications for their lives and for the communities. And this can also make it more difficult to build support for mitigation and adaptation efforts.
Important one, exactly. The cost of adaptation to countries. Therefore, it is really pivotal for the funding arrangements, especially in adaptation and mitigation, as it has been already mandated under the Sharm el-Sheikh implementation plan or in the Glasgow Climate Pact to be effectively mobilized. And exactly, yeah, youth is pivotal in terms of mainstreaming climate awareness to climate education. And this podcast is one of the contribution of youth to mainstream climate education itself. Lovely. Now, before we end this conversation, Ruqia, it's very nice to have you here. What message would you like to convey for young people and listeners concerning our conversation about climate change adaptation and mitigation?
One of my most important messages would be for youth. I'm so happy that I've been noticing that recently so many youths are working on climate change. So many initiatives are being led by youths from different and various countries, especially the less developing countries, as they are the most countries getting badly impacted by the climate crisis. So I'm so happy that we can see these youths are being able to establish their own initiatives and their own movements against climate change to spread awareness and communities. I would love to highlight that young people can play a significant and critical role against climate change, especially in the adaptation and mitigation themes, by taking individual actions, for example, such as reducing their carbon footprint, for example, supporting sustainable practices, advocating for these policy changes. And if we 1, 2, 3, or 10 youths work on such activities, that would spread among other 10 youths, and that would spread a lot, since we can reach huge amount of youths who are working on the same policy. It's also essential for youth. They have to stay updated and informed about all the latest developments in climate science and climate issue, and to be engaged in all discussions at community levels, at family level, with community leaders, with policy makers, and try to engage themselves in any sessions they can face, in any discussion, so that would empower themselves and would empower their knowledge more to have effective rule against climate change. And one other message, it's for policymakers, that they have to give this issue, especially adaptation and mitigation, as I believe adaptation is somehow linked to loss and damage, especially in our countries. For example, in my country, we're facing a challenge with our policymakers when we are proposing such projects in climate adaptation and mitigation. They refuse directly, telling us that we are facing critical issue and emergency issue, which is food insecurity and malnutrition. We have to arrange our funds for these two emergency issues, and they don't think in a wider range that adaptation and mitigation would lead to so many things, and that would lead to make it worse. We'll have more food insecurity, we'll have more malnutrition. So they have to give this more attention. They have to support youth. They have to establish new projects so we can all fight against climate crisis.
Indeed, a very important message. Thank you so much, Ruqia, for sharing your insights and voice on Climate Youth Podcast, Episode 3, designed by youth to mainstream awareness on climate change and urging for climate action. Thank you for listening, and see you on future episodes.